All right, let's just yap about burnout. So, tell me if any of these sound familiar. Each day sucks, and imagining doing this for weeks, months, or years more really sucks. It hasn't even been 1 year since I took my last break. Why do I feel like I need another break already? On paper, I should be happy. My job is good, I'm healthy, I got the means to do the things I want to do. I feel like I have no energy. Whenever I even think about work, I start to feel drained. This week's just a little tough. I just need to power through right now, and then things will start to lighten up. So if you're in denial, these are, I think, all kind of signs that you're on the track toward burnout, which it's not a bad thing. It is what it is, you know? And I think to talk about burnout first, it's important to kind of maybe touch on like how I think we got to this point, and sort of like how we've been maybe conditioned, or at least this was kind of like how I was conditioned. And I think this does play a factor in just approaching life and how you try to deal with these situations. So I think a big thing is school, and kind of like how I grew up. A lot of school was kind of just doing what you're supposed to do. Just do well in school, and then you'll get into a good college. And then if you do well in college, then you'll get a good job. It's a lot of like kind of pain now for reward and security later. And I don't know what it is about like school or kind of like childhood or what have you, but I mean, this type of approach used to work really well. You, like me, I grinded through school, and sometimes it was like pretty painful. And I got into a good school, got good internships, got a good job afterward, and that was all because I did take on a bunch of pain at the time, to get the reward later. And I think there's something about that where like we kind of, I think, tend to forget how painful things were in the past that we did. And when we look at our life in the present, we kind of only see the results of that hard work. And then so it feels like, okay, I did the hard work. I did it before and I have all this good stuff. So like, what's going on? How come I can't do it now anymore? But yeah, something about the present is different than, what we could do in the past. And I think that's important to kind of keep in mind as context here. But kind of going back to the core question of like burnout and why things feel so difficult in the present, I think it's also important to understand like where does this come from? And from what I've learned, it's essentially like there's you're noticing a difference in kind of what you want versus what you're getting, a difference in between like the effort you're putting in versus the yield that you're getting out of it. And this kind of like gap can happen across a lot of dimensions. The main one people talk about is fulfillment or like reward, right? That's kind of what you commonly hear, but there's a bunch of other dimensions too. So like fairness, the values between you versus your company, the workload, how much control you have if you're getting micromanaged, things like that. And also like community, if your social needs are being met. And there's this great video from Dr. K that kind of breaks all of this down very systematically that I would recommend. But yeah, essentially there's this gap between kind of the effort you're putting in versus the yield that you're getting out, or what you want versus what you're getting. And yeah, what we, I think, are conditioned to do about this is trying to use logic to sort of force ourselves into submission, because that's what used to work, right? That's the whole like, oh, things are good on paper, right? I have such a good job and like great opportunities and my career is advancing and I'm making good money. Why am I unhappy? Type of thing, right? And yeah, it's just kind of like the logic doesn't work anymore. or it's no longer enough to kind of like get ourselves to submit. And I kind of view this as like sort of that conditioning or that like grind now for reward later. It's a sort of like kind of like a dirty fuel, right? That used to fuel our actions and our behaviors. And yeah, it is fuel. So it was getting things to go, and it used to work in the past, but now I think, you might start feeling the the sort of negative effects of that. And I think, as adults too, there's also the aspect of like feeling trapped, right? And like the golden handcuffs of like, okay, yeah, I'm in this situation that sucks, but it's really hard to do something about it, or I feel like I can't do anything about it because I can't leave my job, right? Because the job pays so well and I'm living in like an expensive city. Or like, what would I do about my career if I left this job because this is the only thing I've ever known? So really, it's like, what can you do about this? And I think there's a handful of things. Unfortunately, they're all very difficult. And I've kind of like been through this process myself. I did burn out a couple years ago, and kind of had to go through all of these. But I think like having come out the other side now, I do think things are much better. And so I'll kind of go through some of these things, of like what you can do about burnout. So I think the one thing, sort of like the theme so far in this has been kind of like introspecting, or like gaining understanding of like what's going on, right? It's like doing that internal work to figure out what are the things that you value, where are the gaps, what do you want. You can go very, very deep here if you would like, if you're into that kind of stuff, trying to like clarify your values. You can do like a values exercise if you Google that. But really, it's all about just like identifying what's important to you. What type of work do you like to do? What aspects of work do you like? It's like, do you like working with people? And like the stuff that you're working on doesn't really matter as long as the people are people you like to work with. Or do you specifically like to tinker and solve technical problems, or do you like to build robust systems? Or if you're a real freak, do you like to try to deal with coordination problems among people and teams? Just finding out like what do you want? What do you like to do? Yeah, and I think the tricky thing here to notice as well is like thought patterns, because you might say like, oh yeah, I really like to do coding, for example, right? I really like to write code. And then the brain kind of quickly comes in with like the but, right? It's like, oh, but if I want to progress in my career, you do less and less coding as you get more and more senior, right? Or it's like, oh, I like this, but I can't do that for this and this reason. And I think a lot of the times, if you really like dig into that, you may find that like those reasons that come up are again that kind of pattern of like, here's what I should be doing. Here's what like the smart thing on paper is to do for a successful career, right? But that's kind of, if you think about it, that's like what gets you into this problem of burnout in the first place. And so, yeah, that's like another thing to examine, is like those rebuttals and like where they're coming from, and like what is actually underneath those that is actually important to you. So that's one thing. I think the base thing to do is like just introspect and like just build some understanding of what's going on, and what you actually want. Then logistical things, there's kind of two things you can really do here if you're in like an environment where you're burnt out. One is to try to improve the current environment, right? So if you've identified the gaps of like where you're like not happy with things, or where you feel like you're not getting sufficient return on what you're putting in, you can try to change the current environment. Easier said than done, obviously, but if you can change things to get you more return, right, get you more opportunities, or more time to do things that you like, that might help. You can change the environment by just like leaving, right, like going to a different environment, and that will like break you out of this loop. Obviously also very difficult if you're stuck. There's another thing you can do, which is you can kind of like change your own mind about things, change your internal perceptions or expectations. Also difficult, but maybe you're expecting more out of the company than what it can give you, right? Or your work. If you expect your work to be very fulfilling and it just isn't that fulfilling or won't be able to be that fulfilling, then maybe, you know, you got to find fulfillment elsewhere and like change your expectations. The other things, personally, what I ended up doing was taking time to rest and taking time to reconnect to what I enjoyed. And I think this is really what leads into, in my opinion, what's like the sort of end game rebuild that you can do. And that's sort of like this slowly replacing this use of like the dirty fuel and the shoulds and like the, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do, and replacing that with some more like sustainable kind of like, you know, you can call it like pure fuel, or like I kind of call it like inspiring fuel. And that comes from like reconnecting with what you actually enjoy doing, you know, finding what's fun again. I know a big thing for me at that time when I left my job was like I realized I wasn't allowing myself to like do things that were fun because I was so focused on like being productive. And you know, that was like a big realization for me where it's like, oh, this is like some pretty heavy conditioning going on. So yeah, reconnect to what's fun for you. Would highly recommend. And then once you start doing that, you sort of like can develop that connection and like build more discernment. And then yeah, as you kind of continue cultivating that, I think really what's gonna, in my opinion, what's gonna be sustainable and engaging in the long term is in line with like stuff that's fun for you and stuff that you enjoy. And so yeah, what this means, I think logistically, is like keeping an eye out for opportunities of stuff that is actually really enjoyable and just doubling down on those and try to expand in those directions, even if, you know, those things may not be the sort of quote unquote like smart things to do on paper, or like the optimal things to do, right? I think if they're enjoyable and they make you not hate life, then maybe that is actually the optimal thing to do. So I'll end with sort of a broad vision of what I think a lot of people want, including myself. And it's like really on the day to day, right? You want to be enjoying what you're working on most of the time. Of course, there's going to be like some days where they're difficult and things are hard, but you know, having like most of the days be pretty good. So having the day to day be enjoyable, and also having the thing that you're building toward also be aligned with your values, right? So then it's like at the micro level, things are good. At the macro level, you're moving in the direction you want to be going in. That's, I think, like ideal. I don't know if there's like more that I could ask for if I was in that position. So yeah, if things aren't like that, I want to maybe give you some hope that like things can be like that. It's going to be tough, but you can build an environment that's like that. All right. See you in the next one.